The boardroom was sealed tight, the kind of room designed to keep decisions from leaking out. Glass walls, dark wood, leather chairs that didn't creak when you shifted your weight. 42 floors above Chicago, the city looked distant and orderly, like a model someone else was responsible for maintaining. We were halfway through a quarterly review. Numbers on a screen, forecasts, controlled voices, men who measured risk for a living speaking calmly about things that would cost other people their jobs. My phone vibrated once against the table. Not a call, not repeated, just a single, deliberate pulse, enough to be intentional. I didn't reach for it immediately. I waited until the man across from me finished his sentence, until there was a natural pause, like the room itself allowed me to move. Then I glanced down. One message. From Lena. I'll come home late. Don't call. No greeting. No explanation. No attempt to soften it. Just a statement, followed by an instruction. I read it once. Then again. Slower the second time. The words didn't change, but the weight of them did. They weren't careless. They were confident. Like she had already decided what my role was in that moment, and it wasn't someone whose opinion mattered. I noticed how clean the sentence was. No wasted language. No apology. She wasn't asking. She was managing. My thumb hovered for a second longer than I expected. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I realized, very clearly, that whatever I sent would be final. So I didn't dress it up. Then don't come home. No punctuation. No explanation. No emotion added for effect. I sent it, turned the phone face down, and placed both hands flat on the table again. The wood was cool, solid, real. The meeting continued without interruption. Someone resumed talking about margins. Another man nodded. A pen clicked. A slide advanced. No one in that room noticed anything had happened. But I did. And in that moment, quiet, contained, unremarkable to everyone else, something ended cleanly, without a scene. The marriage didn't collapse. It simply stopped. Before that day, nothing about my life looked unstable from the outside. That's the part people never understand later. How ordinary everything was. How functional. How clean the routines felt. I woke up early, worked long hours, came home to a house that stayed in order because I believed order was a form of respect. We ate dinner together when schedules aligned. We talked about logistics more than feelings. Trips were planned months out. Bills were paid on time. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no visible fractures. If you asked me then, I would have said the marriage was solid. Not passionate, not romantic in a movie sense, but dependable, grown, built on the idea that two adults didn't need constant reassurance to stay aligned. Lena often came home late. That had become normal. Sometimes it was friends, sometimes work dinners, sometimes vague plans that didn't quite form into a story. I didn't interrogate the details. I didn't check timestamps. I didn't ask who else was there. I told myself that trust didn't need surveillance. That asking too many questions was how people created problems that didn't exist yet. I'd seen enough relationships implode under the weight of suspicion masquerading as honesty. I didn't want to be that man, counting minutes, reading between lines, turning silence into an accusation. So I stayed quiet. If she said she was tired, I accepted it. If she said a meeting ran long, I believed her. If she came home distracted, phone face down, mind somewhere else, I gave her space. I mistook restraint for maturity. Evenings settled into a predictable shape. I'd get home first, change clothes, check email one last time, then shut the laptop like a signal to myself that the day was done. Sometimes I cooked. Sometimes we ordered in. If she wasn't home yet, I ate alone without resentment. I told myself adults didn't need synchronized schedules to be committed. Weekends were steady. Groceries, laundry, occasional social obligations. We moved through shared spaces easily, like two people who knew the choreography by heart. Looking back, the signs were there, but they were subtle enough to dismiss without effort. Her questions about my work became oddly specific. Timelines, travel dates, who I'd be meeting. Not accusatory, just precise. I answered without hesitation, assuming curiosity meant engagement. Her phone never left her hand anymore. If it did, it stayed face down. I noticed it the way you notice a clock ticking louder at night, not alarming, just present. There were small shifts in tone. Slight impatience where there used to be neutrality. A softness that came and went unpredictably. But nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to without sounding paranoid. And I didn't want to sound paranoid. I believed that stability was something you protected by not overanalyzing it. That marriage was maintained through consistency, not vigilance. That love didn't require constant confirmation, just continued participation. So I participated. I showed up. I didn't pry. I didn't keep score. I let inconsistencies slide because I believed that peace was more valuable than precision. What I didn't understand then was that silence isn't always trust. Sometimes it's just avoidance with better manners. And by the time I read that message in the boardroom, I realized something uncomfortable but undeniable. The marriage hadn't ended suddenly. It had been eroding quietly, while I was busy believing that not looking too closely was the same thing as being secure. After that message, nothing in the house actually changed. That was the strange part. The lights still came on at the same time in the evening. The thermostat stayed where it always was. Her shoes still lined up by the door. Her coffee mug still sat in the sink some mornings, rinsed but not washed. If someone had walked through our home, they wouldn't have sensed a disruption. It still looked like a shared life. But I wasn't inside it the same way anymore. Something had reset. Not emotionally, but cognitively. Like a switch I hadn't known existed finally flipped. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt in the way people expect. I was alert. Details stopped being background noise. When Lena said she was running late, I didn't respond with understanding or irritation. I simply noted the time. When she mentioned names, I didn't react, but I remembered them. When she asked questions about my schedule, I didn't feel flattered or defensive. I answered carefully, accurately, without elaboration. It wasn't a game. I wasn't testing her. I had just stopped cushioning reality. Patterns began to form where before there had only been isolated moments. Late nights clustered around certain days. Silence followed specific types of questions. Her energy shifted depending on whether she'd been out or home all evening. These weren't dramatic revelations, just repetitions that finally lined up once I allowed myself to see them together. I didn't confront her. That surprised even me. I realized I had no interest in explanations that arrived only after pressure was applied. I didn't want a performance. I didn't want reassurance delivered on demand. If something was true, it would remain true without interrogation. So I observed. Conversations became shorter, not colder, just more efficient. I stopped filling pauses. Stopped volunteering context. When she spoke, I listened without shaping my response around how it might land. I wasn't trying to preserve the mood anymore. At night, if she wasn't home, I didn't text. I didn't ask for updates. I didn't sit with the television on low volume pretending I wasn't waiting. I went to bed when I was tired. I woke up early. My routines stayed intact, but the emotional dependency underneath them dissolved. I noticed how often she checked her phone while talking to me. Not nervously, confidently. As if whatever was happening elsewhere was more anchored than what was happening in front of her. I noticed how she'd step into another room to answer calls she used to take openly. None of this shocked me. That was the most telling part. The shift wasn't about discovering something new. It was about admitting something I'd already known in fragments but never assembled. I stopped explaining away inconsistencies as stress or timing or adulthood being messy. I let them be what they were. There's a moment, quiet and internal, when you stop asking, "Is this real?" and start asking, "What am I going to do with what I already see?" That was the moment I entered. I didn't feel betrayed yet. Betrayal implies a sudden break in expectation. This felt more like clarity. Like reading the fine print you'd skipped over because the font was small and the paper looked official enough. I wasn't trying to catch her. I was just no longer invested in being wrong. And with that, my role shifted. Not into an accuser. Not into a victim. Into a witness. Outwardly, I remained the same man, measured, present, reliable. But internally, I had stepped back far enough to see the shape of things without needing to interfere. I didn't need proof yet. I needed alignment between what I felt and what I allowed myself to acknowledge. Once that happened, everything else became a matter of time. There was no dramatic moment where I decided to stop trying. No sleepless night. No final argument rehearsed in my head. No surge of anger that burned something clean. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent. I woke up one morning a few days after the message, went through my routine, and realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not a text. Not an explanation. Not a shift in her behavior that would suggest she'd noticed the distance growing between us. The absence of expectation was noticeable. Like a low-level noise that had been running for years had finally shut off. I didn't feel relief. I felt neutral. That's when I understood the break had already happened. I stopped texting her unless it was necessary. Logistics only. Times, addresses, short confirmations. If she sent something casual, an update, a comment about her day, I acknowledged it without extending the conversation. No questions, no hooks, no emotional invitations. At home, I moved through the space like a man renting a room he planned to leave in good condition. I cleaned up after myself. I didn't rearrange anything. I didn't invest in the atmosphere. I didn't withdraw either. I just stopped contributing more than was required. She didn't notice at first. Or maybe she did and assumed it was temporary, work stress, fatigue, something that would correct itself if left alone. People who feel secure often mistake detachment for a phase. I didn't correct that assumption. I also didn't try to save anything. That surprised me more than her behavior ever had. I realized I had no interest in salvaging a version of the marriage that required me to ignore what I now saw clearly. Fixing it would have meant negotiating with reality, asking myself to accept partial truths in exchange for familiarity. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. There's a point where the idea of working on things starts to feel dishonest. Not because the effort is wrong, but because the foundation you'd be working from is already compromised. Any repair would be cosmetic, temporary reinforcement over structural failure. So I stopped pretending there was a structure left to reinforce. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't threaten separation or hint at consequences. I didn't collect leverage in conversations or store up grievances for later use. I simply withdrew my participation from the emotional economy of the marriage. I stopped explaining myself, stopped framing my choices in ways she'd find acceptable. If I stayed late at work, I didn't justify it. If I went to bed early, I didn't apologize for it. If I declined plans, I declined them without cushioning the impact. Not to punish her. To align myself. Outwardly, everything still looked intact. We shared meals occasionally. We existed in the same rooms. We spoke politely. Anyone watching would have seen a couple in a quiet phase, busy, tired, maybe a little disconnected. But internally, I had already stepped into the future. A version of my life where I wasn't responsible for managing someone else's narrative. Where I didn't need to react to half-truths or adjust myself to maintain a fragile peace. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't fantasizing about outcomes. I was simplifying. The emotional labor stopped. The self-doubt stopped. The impulse to explain stopped. What replaced it wasn't bitterness, it was focus. I understood something fundamental then. Endings don't always announce themselves with chaos. Sometimes they arrive as clarity so complete that continuing feels unnecessary. From that point forward, I wasn't trying to understand Lena. I was preparing to move forward without her version of events having any influence over my decisions. The marriage still existed on paper. But in every way that mattered, I was already gone. Once I stopped engaging, the noise settled enough for me to hear things clearly. Not conversations, patterns. I didn't suddenly become suspicious. I didn't start checking her phone or tracking her movements. That would have implied I was still invested in uncovering something that could change my mind. I wasn't. What I did instead was pay attention in the same way I paid attention at work. Without emotion, without urgency, without the need for immediate conclusions. Facts don't rush you. They wait. I noticed who called her regularly, and who didn't. Certain names appeared only at certain times of day. Others never rang when I was in the room. Some calls were short and efficient. Others required privacy. She didn't say that explicitly, of course. She just stood up mid-sentence and walked away when those calls came in. I noted when her phone went silent for hours. Not during meetings, not during dinners with friends, but during windows of time that were otherwise unaccounted for. Silence, I learned, was more revealing than activity. I started recognizing her rhythms. The cadence of her evenings. The difference between nights she came home energized and nights she came home muted. When she showered immediately. When she didn't. When she talked too much about trivial things, like she was filling space that didn't need filling. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. If it had been dramatic, I might have reacted. Might have disrupted the process by demanding clarity before I was ready to accept it. Instead, the truth assembled itself slowly, like a picture coming into focus once you stop adjusting the lens. I kept my own behavior steady. No baiting, no tests, no sudden changes designed to provoke a reaction. I didn't want to influence outcomes. I wanted to see what happened when I removed myself as a variable. People reveal the most when they believe they aren't being watched. And Lena believed that. She spoke more freely around me once she sensed I wasn't asking questions. She filled silences with explanations I hadn't requested. She volunteered information that didn't need to be shared, details that only mattered if she was trying to manage a narrative. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge inconsistencies when they surfaced. I let them sit there, unresolved. Contradictions have a way of multiplying when they aren't corrected immediately. Names repeated. Locations overlapped. Stories shifted subtly depending on the day. Not enough to raise alarms, but enough to form a pattern once you lined them up. I didn't write anything down. I didn't need to. The clarity didn't come from documentation. It came from consistency. From watching the same behaviors repeat under slightly different circumstances. From noticing how certain truths required effort to maintain, while others held their shape without reinforcement. Tension grew, but not between us. It grew inside me, as patience. Not the kind that waits for improvement, but the kind that allows events to unfold without interference. The kind that trusts time to do what confrontation often ruins. I wasn't waiting for a confession. I was waiting for inevitability. At work, I handled problems the same way. When systems failed, it was rarely because of one catastrophic error. It was because of small, ignored deviations that eventually aligned. Fixing them didn't require panic. It required allowing the system to show you where it was already breaking. That's what this was. A system under quiet strain. I knew then that whatever was happening didn't need my participation to continue, and it wouldn't need my permission to end. My role wasn't to stop it or expose it. My role was to stay still long enough for the truth to surface on its own. And it was surfacing. Not all at once. Not cleanly. But steadily. And once I saw that, I understood something important. The waiting wasn't passive. It was deliberate. Because when the moment finally came, when the story collapsed under its own weight, I wanted to be certain that nothing I said or did had accelerated it artificially. I wanted the end to belong entirely to reality. Not to me. At some point, it stopped feeling like a marriage problem. That realization didn't arrive with panic. It arrived with calculation. I began to notice overlaps I couldn't ignore, not because I was looking for them, but because they crossed into spaces I understood too well to dismiss. Names I'd heard Lena mention casually started appearing in places they didn't belong. Conversations she referenced loosely aligned with meetings I knew about through work. Timelines intersected in ways that felt inefficient at best, reckless at worst. It wasn't jealousy that sharpened my attention. It was risk. I'd spent years learning how to recognize exposure before it turned into loss. Not emotionally, operationally. When something that's supposed to be contained starts bleeding into other systems, you don't ask whether it was intentional. You assess impact. I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't even acknowledge the overlap out loud. But I began separating mental categories that had once shared space. What used to be our life and my work became distinct columns in my mind, no longer allowed to contaminate each other. I tightened my routines, not dramatically, just enough to remove unnecessary access. Calendars became private. Calls were taken behind closed doors. Information flowed one way instead of both. I stopped mentioning certain projects entirely. Not out of spite, out of responsibility. There were coincidences that stopped feeling coincidental. A name she dropped at dinner that reappeared in a different context the following week. A city she mentioned visiting casually that aligned too cleanly with a vendor trip I declined. A question she asked about my schedule that arrived a little too precisely timed. None of it was illegal. None of it was explosive. But it was careless. And carelessness is how problems spread. I realized then that whatever was happening in her private life wasn't staying private. It was brushing up against environments that didn't tolerate ambiguity. Places where assumptions had consequences. Where trust was transactional and exposure wasn't emotional, it was measurable. That changed the stakes. I wasn't protecting a marriage anymore. I was protecting structure, reputation, distance, the kind of separation that keeps fallout contained when things eventually collapse. I didn't need proof of intent to act responsibly. I only needed confirmation that boundaries were being treated as flexible by someone who didn't bear the cost of their failure. That's when I fully stepped out of the role of husband. Not publicly, not symbolically, functionally. I stopped assuming alignment, stopped assuming discretion, stopped assuming that what I withheld out of respect would be handled with the same care on the other side. It was an adjustment, not an escalation. And it confirmed something I hadn't articulated until then. Whatever Lena was involved in had already exceeded the scope of something I was willing to absorb quietly. Not because of betrayal, but because of exposure. The marriage had been personal. This wasn't. I didn't interfere. I didn't intervene. I didn't insert myself into situations that weren't mine to manage. I just made sure that when the consequences arrived, and they always do, they would land where they belonged. Not on me. Not on the systems I was responsible for maintaining. The line between her choices and my obligations had blurred for too long. I corrected that, cleanly, without announcement. From that point on, I wasn't watching out of curiosity. I was watching to ensure separation held. Because once personal decisions start creating external risk, silence stops being generosity. It becomes liability. And I wasn't willing to carry that for her. The meeting didn't happen because I asked for it. That would have implied urgency, or emotion, or a belief that something could still be negotiated. It happened because Lena could feel the absence. Distance has weight. When it settles in quietly, people sense it long before they understand it. Conversations shorten. Reassurance stops arriving unprompted. The familiar resistance, questions, explanations, shared irritation, disappears. What's left is a silence that doesn't ask to be filled. She noticed that. One evening she asked, carefully, if we could talk. Not right away. Not in the kitchen or the bedroom. Later. Neutral ground. A tone that suggested seriousness without admitting fear. I agreed. Not because I owed her the conversation, but because I had nothing to avoid. We met at a small place near the river. Quiet. Clean. The kind of restaurant people choose when they want to be heard without being seen. I arrived on time. She was already there, sitting upright, hands folded around a glass she hadn't touched. She started talking before the menus came. Apologies first. General ones. Regret without specifics. She spoke about stress, confusion, feeling disconnected, not knowing how things had drifted. She said my distance scared her. Said she didn't recognize me lately. I listened without interrupting. Then came the explanations. Not accusations, just narratives. Work pressures. Miscommunications. Timing. She spoke in abstractions, like someone hoping the right combination of words would produce relief. At one point she reached across the table. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in either. I let her hand rest there alone, unsupported. When she paused, waiting for a response, I said very little. I told her I'd heard what she said. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I wasn't confused. That seemed to unsettle her more than silence would have. She asked what I wanted to do. Asked if I was willing to try. Asked if this was fixable. I looked at her then, really looked. Not for evidence. Not for truth. Just for alignment. And I realized the conversation had already done its work. Nothing she said changed what I knew. Nothing she withheld surprised me. The meeting wasn't revealing anything new. It was confirming what had already become stable inside me. I told her I wasn't interested in repairing something that no longer reflected reality. I didn't accuse her of betrayal. I didn't list observations or challenge inconsistencies. I didn't ask for confessions. I told her I had stepped out of the marriage weeks ago, not physically, not publicly, but decisively. That I had made peace with that choice. She cried then, quietly, controlled, the way people cry when they realize persuasion isn't working. She said she felt blindsided. Said she didn't know things were that far gone. I believed her. People often don't notice the exact moment someone stops trying. They only notice when the consequences arrive. I paid the bill. Not out of obligation, out of habit. Outside, the air was cool. The city moved the way it always does, indifferent and efficient. We stood there for a moment without touching. She asked if this was really it. I nodded. Not because I wanted it to hurt, but because clarity is a form of respect when there's nothing left to negotiate. The meeting didn't change the outcome. It just removed any doubt that the decision had already been made, long before either of us sat down to talk. I went home alone, and for the first time since that message in the boardroom, I felt no tension at all. Just completion. After the meeting, I didn't feel the urge to manage what came next. That was new for me. For most of my life, when something destabilized, my instinct was to contain it, to control variables, anticipate reactions, guide outcomes toward the least damaging resolution. This time, I stepped back. Not out of exhaustion, but out of certainty. I had already exited the equation. What followed didn't require my input. In fact, Any interference on my part would have distorted the process. So I stayed where I was, present, attentive, but uninvolved. Lena tried, at first, to restore normalcy. Not in words, but in behavior. Small gestures. Familiar routines reintroduced carefully, like she was testing whether the old rules still applied. She'd ask practical questions with emotional undertones. She'd linger in shared spaces a little longer than necessary. I responded politely, briefly, without invitation. That's when the mistakes began. Not because she was careless, but because she assumed she still understood the environment. People make errors when they believe the system around them is stable. When they think they know which variables matter and which don't. She miscalculated silence. Without pressure from me, conversations elsewhere grew looser. Details slipped. Timelines overlapped more obviously. Stories that once held together with effort began to fray when no one was actively reinforcing them. I heard things secondhand, not through gossip, through inevitability. Someone said too much in the wrong context. Someone else repeated it with slight variations. A decision made casually landed in a place where it couldn't be retracted. None of it came from me. That was the important part. I didn't confront. I didn't reveal what I knew. I didn't expose inconsistencies when they passed through my awareness. I let them exist independently, uncorrected. When narratives aren't managed, they collapse under their own weight. And they did. What had once been contained by discretion became visible through misalignment. Not scandalous, just undeniable. The kind of truth that doesn't need a witness to confirm it. It announces itself through consequence. I watched from a distance that was both emotional and practical. There's a strange calm that comes when you're no longer invested in being believed. When your position doesn't depend on persuading anyone of anything. I didn't need validation. I didn't need acknowledgement. I already knew where I stood. At some point, Lena realized she was losing control of the narrative. That's when she stopped trying to explain and started trying to minimize. Not to me, to others. She adjusted language, avoided certain names, changed routines again, this time too late to be effective. Momentum doesn't reverse just because someone notices it. By then, the process had its own inertia. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was distance, clean and expansive. Like watching a structure being dismantled by engineers who had already assessed it as unsound. When the final pieces fell into place, there was no dramatic reveal. No singular moment where everything came out at once. Just a quiet convergence of facts that left no room for interpretation. The truth didn't surface because I dragged it into the light. It surfaced because no one was holding it together anymore. And when that happened, I didn't step forward. I stayed where I was. Because the outcome didn't belong to me. I had made my decision long before events reached their conclusion. What unfolded afterward wasn't closure, it was confirmation. And confirmation doesn't require participation. It just requires patience. When it was finally over, there was no moment that felt like an ending. No door slammed. No confrontation. No conversation that wrapped everything up with language neat enough to remember later. The conclusion arrived the way most real things do. Spread out over days, then weeks, until one morning I realized nothing was unresolved anymore. The facts were settled. The logistics followed naturally. Accounts were separated without drama. Responsibilities were divided without argument. We spoke rarely, and when we did, it was with the neutrality of people who no longer needed anything from each other except clarity. There was no apology that mattered at that stage. Not because apologies are useless, but because timing determines their weight. Words offered after outcomes are known don't change anything. They only attempt to soften consequences that have already been accepted. I didn't reject what she said. I just didn't need it. People assume resolution comes with relief or triumph. Like surviving something automatically produces gratitude or pride. That wasn't my experience. What I felt was alignment. The quiet sense that my internal reality finally matched my external one. There was no victory in being right. And no regret in not fighting harder. I had made the decision early, before explanations, before admissions, before the collapse made everything obvious to everyone else. That decision carried me through the end without requiring emotional recalibration. I didn't need to grieve something I'd already released. I didn't need to justify myself to anyone either. Not to friends who asked careful questions. Not to colleagues who noticed the change in my schedule. Not even to Lena, when she tried one last time to understand how things had slipped beyond repair without a single explosive moment. I told her the truth. That the marriage didn't end because of one choice or one mistake. It ended because I stopped pretending I didn't see the whole picture. That answer didn't satisfy her. But it wasn't meant to. There's a difference between closure and acceptance. Closure implies a shared understanding, a mutual conclusion reached through dialogue. Acceptance doesn't require agreement. It only requires honesty with yourself. I had that. What surprised me most was how quickly life restabilized once the ambiguity was gone. Energy returned, not in bursts, but steadily. Focus sharpened. Decisions became simpler without the background noise of unspoken tension. I slept better. I worked cleaner. I spoke less, but with more precision. The absence of emotional negotiation freed up space I hadn't realized I'd been occupying for years. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't managing another person's version of events. I was simply moving forward inside my own boundaries. There was no need to revisit the past. No desire to reinterpret it. The story didn't need editing. It was complete as it was. When people asked how I was doing, I told them the truth in the most accurate way I could. I'm fine. Not optimistic. Not devastated. Not reinvented. Just fine. Because the decision that mattered, the one that determined everything that followed, had been made long before the situation reached its visible conclusion. And by the time it was over, I wasn't standing at the end of something painful. I was already well into what came next. Life didn't restart. It continued. That distinction mattered to me. There was no dramatic reinvention, no declaration that I was entering a new chapter. My days kept their structure. Work filled its usual hours. Mornings stayed quiet. Evenings developed a different rhythm, not better or worse, just cleaner. Fewer negotiations. Fewer pauses meant for someone else to catch up. The past stopped pulling at me once I stopped revisiting it. I didn't replay conversations. I didn't reframe decisions. I didn't wonder whether a different tone or one more discussion would have changed anything. The answer to those questions had already been settled, not emotionally, but practically. I had made my choice early. Before explanations were offered. Before apologies were shaped. Before the truth became obvious enough for other people to acknowledge. That timing mattered. Lena believed she was setting the rules when she sent that message. Establishing distance. Control. Terms. I don't think she understood what she was actually doing in that moment. She wasn't creating space. She was closing the door. I just happened to notice before she did. Now, when I think back on it, I don't feel anger. And I don't feel loss in the way people expect. What I feel is recognition. The understanding that some endings are clean precisely because they aren't fought. I didn't win anything. I didn't lose myself either. I stepped forward when staying would have required pretending. And once you stop pretending, the future doesn't need to be dramatic to be solid. It just needs to be honest. That was enough.